basically our youth forum on digital transformation and youth. And we're going to be getting presentations from personnel from the UE Students Guild here at St. Augustine campus and also one other. I'm not the one taking you through this youth forum though. The facilitator is Mr. Michael Joseph, who is the Guild representative for the Faculty of Science and Technology at the UE St. Augustine campus. So I will now invite Mr. Michael Joseph to take the floor and manage this session. Michael, take it away.
Good afternoon. Do you hear me clearly?
Yes, we are.
Excellent. So good afternoon, Mr. Casimir. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon to all the listeners, wherever in the world you are today. So basically, I would like to say welcome to all of you. My name is Michael Joseph. As said before, I'm the Faculty of Science and Technology representative on the Guild Council for the UE St. Augustine. And I will be your moderator for this afternoon's discussion. This afternoon's proceedings are hosted by the Office of the Guild Librarian and the Caribbean Telecommunications Unit, hereafter referred to as the CTU. It is not only my honor, but pleasure to moderate this afternoon's activity. Our presenters today are student leaders on the Guild Council. They are namely the President, Mr. Warren Anderson, the Publications Committee Chairperson, Mr. Kendell Vincent, and the International Affairs Committee Chairperson, Mr. Jensen Samaroo. The commentator, on each of their presentations is Mr. Jonathan Felix, who is a transdisciplinary studies person with specializations in sociology, design, media, and cultural studies. And his research interests include higher education, alternative media, and digital cultures. With that being said, we'll now begin, and I would like to notify Mr. Anderson that he will soon begin. Just a quick insight, as I said before, Mr. Anderson is the President of the Guild Council of St. Augustine. His presentation this afternoon is on the topic of digital transformation, education, and youth struggles and solutions. Mr. Anderson has a few definitions that should be noted in his presentation so that context is understood throughout. When he uses the word youth, he refers to persons ages 12 to 29, and this is taken from the Youth Policy of Trinidad and Tobago 2012-2017. When he uses the term tertiary education builds on secondary education, providing learning activities in specialized fields of education. It aims at learning at high levels of complexity and specialization. Tertiary education includes what is commonly understood as an academic education, but also includes advanced vocational or professional education. When he uses the word poverty, poverty is the denial of choices and opportunities, a violation of human dignity. It means a lack of basic capacity to participate effectively in society. This is taken from the United Nations, 1998. Literacy is the ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, communicate, and compute using printed and written and visual materials associated with varying contexts. When he uses the term Caribbean, he refers to members of the CARICOM states. Simulation, a model or set of problems or events that can be used to teach someone how to do something, or the process of making such a model. And this is taken from the Cambridge Dictionary. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, I introduce you to Mr. Warren Anderson, the President of the Guild of Students, UE St. Augustine.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I would like to say thank you very much to the CTU for providing us with this forum today. My intention here this afternoon is really to provide a conceptual presentation based on the struggles that youth have. I take an interesting approach in terms of bridging the gap between our struggles and our proposals in terms of meeting these struggles. So I ask everyone to strap in, and I look forward to feedback in the end of it. So I begin by saying it's all fun and games until someone loses an eye. In this case, the eye is the iPhone. Young people in this time have grown a dependency on our smart devices. It is said by Porter et al. In 2016 that young people's use of mobile phones is also expanding exponentially across the developing world, and that cell phone adoption among students in the developing world has also increased significantly, with many reporting ownership and penetration rates exceeding 100%. So for the purpose of this presentation, we will consider young people in respect to tertiary education. And for a perspective on tertiary education, or for us to frame just how, where we're looking at with tertiary education, I would have referred to the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago. And there, I was able to withdraw some, based on how they define a BSc or a bachelor, the goals that one should attain in getting this bachelor. And it says that one should be able to apply the methods and techniques that they have learned to review, consolidate, extend, and apply their knowledge and understanding, and to initiate and carry out projects, critically evaluate arguments, assumptions, abstract concepts, and data that may be incomplete, to make judgments and to frame appropriate questions to achieve a solution, or identify a range of solutions to a problem. Also, they indicate that one should be able to apply a conceptual and problem-solving abilities in an employment context, as well as communicate, inform ideas, problems, and solutions to both specialist and non-specialist audiences. Being a tertiary education student myself, it is my observation that society is losing faith in not just the education system, but in the outputs of the education system. And part of this is materialized in the job market, saying to students and graduates that there's not enough work experience coming out of graduation and into job application. What this really says is that the student upon graduation is not job ready, does not have that tacit knowledge that empowers us to gain employment. So it provides an opportunity for us. Given that 77.3% of internet users in Trinidad and Tobago, so that's 77.3% of Trinidad and Tobago that are internet users, right? And considering that 20% of these people are below the poverty line, we already have an appreciation that getting empowered through devices and access to internet can affect those below the poverty lines. But in relation to youth, what we're seeing is that there's a gap in terms of cultural context, right? What do I mean by this? students are coming through the system, and what we're gaining, the lack of tacit knowledge is really coming about through the lack of engagement in the experience. We're mostly engaging with theory throughout our program. And how do I propose for us to fix this? Well, we should be considering through the ICT space how we infect education through informal education. And this is considering the fact that there are different types of learners that the educational space right now does not cater for. There are auditory learners, kinesthetic learners, reading or writing learners, and visual learners. Most of the times, without having a practicum or practical learning, we are engaged with reading and writing. How can we fix, therefore, the economic problem as well as the cultural problem? Well, the entertainment industry provides an answer for us. And I'll refer to some of the economic figures in the entertainment industry as it relates to music, books, movies, and also video games. The book industry as it stands, and these figures are from 2019, is a $92.8 billion industry. The music industry is a $20 billion industry according to Variety. And the movie industry is a $101 billion industry. Finally, the video game industry is $18.4 billion. The gap, therefore, the economic gap or the opportunity for us to fill the economic gap is one of being honest to ourselves and what we are able to provide in the Caribbean. I like to refer to the talent and the culture of the Caribbean as the new oil, right? And it says that we should be, as rentier economies, small island developing states who have typically been rentier economies working with oil, we need to start to examine opportunities in our human resources. So we're very well aware that we're very talented in areas of music and movies, etc., plays and these things. ICT and communication technology, information systems, etc., give us the opportunity to engage learning through the digital industries, like movie, digital books, and these things. But I would like to focus on the video game industry because what it does is it brings together all the types of learning: auditory, kinesthetic, reading, writing, and even visual, right? It gives combined with tertiary education, it gives tertiary education institutions the opportunity to apply situated learning. Situated learning theory is commonly used as instructional theory employed with games for learning and is often related to epistemic games, games where players play in a game experience that simulates a respective professional activity. What does this mean? The classroom experience, we can therefore engage in video games, right? And outside of the classroom experience, we can actually become industrious and sell our culture through the economic means that I have provided before, but also understanding that we have a very unique culture here that needs to be marketed outside. So it's not just about learning about ourselves in a digital space in the classroom, but it's also about offering to the world a window into our space. And for example, I'll say, how many times have we seen Spider-Man movies, Batman movies. They will never stop making these movies. They're probably on 60, 20, 50 by now. But where are the movies about our folklore? Where are the games about our folklore? And video gaming and these things provide opportunities by being inside the space to not just learn about our history and our culture, but to also sell it to the world and fix the economic problem that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. Truly enriching presentation. I now invite Mr. Felix, who is an academic out of Vietnam, to give his comments on Mr. Anderson's presentation. Mr. Felix, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, everyone. Just to comment on the first presentation here very quickly, and I'm going to attempt to try to stay on topic here. With respect to the education system, as with many other challenges, the first thing is that in understanding digital transformation, what digital transformation is, I think we first need to realize that digital transformation isn't necessarily the solution to problems. It can be very helpful in enhancing existing solutions once it is that we have them, but that is premised on the fact that we're able to sufficiently identify what the issues are. But let's go back even further. We need to be able to determine what outcome that we're looking for, right? And only then we can be able to see if perhaps digital transformation in whatever way that it's articulated will actually be helpful for us. Because it's actually very problematic to think that somehow once technology is involved, it's automatically something positive that we'll be able to derive all the benefits from it. So we want to try to avoid a sort of technological determinism, so to speak. And this is really a view that, whether something is technically feasible, that means that it is something that is desirable, and it's something that is, without a doubt, going to be realized in practice. So that's something we have to be very clear on, that whenever there are issues, technology is not going to fix those issues. In many instances, it can actually either create new issues or take the existing issues that we have and make them worse. As it relates to the education sector, each sphere of the education sector has its own unique challenges, from primary all the way up to higher education, vocational education, special education, and so on and so forth. So there needs to really be a critical look at what is the overall outcome, what is really expected here. And, there was the discussion in terms of moving Caribbean culture forward and so on and so forth. But there's some other things that we need to take into account. Now, by and large, compared to other parts of the world, the Caribbean is a very, very small place that does not show up on maps. People do not know about us. And we really do think that we're very big, but we're actually very small. This is the reason why it is that people lump the Caribbean and Latin America together, because the Caribbean in many instances only becomes visible through its association with Latin America, and that is primarily geographical. Okay. The other thing that we have to take into consideration as well is that even though we say that we are the Caribbean and we are from a particular space, the history of the Caribbean is one of discontinuity and fracture, and we are not a unified state, right? We are a collection of islands. We're geographically close to each other. So culturally speaking, I don't think it is that we have a very clear unified identity, so to speak. And this is something that also plays a part in terms of how it is that we deal with particular types of issues, and whether or not digital transformation actually is the way forward. So I think very much so we need to reconsider what the real issues are, and not see the issues in terms of silos and think that, okay, the issue is really a teaching issue. We don't have enough teachers, or probably it is that people are not teaching the right way. there are many different things that we need to look at. And what I, in more or less closing this particular commentary on the first presentation, I would say we need to look at context and whether the context that we're working in, it fosters the need for digital transformation, and whether the context that we're working in, it actually enables certain issues, or it can be used to leverage certain issues. Because regardless of whatever ideas that we come up with, digital transformation is not something that we can impose from a top-down position, right? It has to be something that is negotiated. We ask ourselves, is this something that people actually want? So, there are usually some assumptions that we have when we speak about technology as technology being something good and desirable and wholesome, but that is not often the case. That's the assumption that we usually have, this sort of utopian assumption as it relates to technology. It doesn't mean that it's bad, but what I'm saying, as I draw this section to a close here, is, we really need to consider what are the real problems, what are the roots of the problems, and if at this junction in trying to address those issues, if digital transformation is needed and if it's even desirable. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Felix. I would now like to introduce our next presenter. His name is Kendell Vincent, and he is the Publications Committee Chairperson of the University of the West Indies Guild Council for the academic year 2020-2021. He's going to be presenting on the topic, Digital Transformation and the Future of Work for the Young Professional. So I now ask Mr. Vincent to take the floor. I just remind you, you have 5 to 8 minutes to make your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Joseph, for your introduction. Let me just thank all protocols observed. Let me just thank the Caribbean CTU for giving us this opportunity and this platform here today to present from a youth perspective. One of the things that, I would like to basically present on today deals with the topic of the young professional and how it relates to digital transformation. One of the things, even as we undergo this COVID-19 pandemic, what it has shown us is that some of the things that, we would have been accustomed to no longer gonna be applicable. So let me just turn your attention to the screen. So I'll start off with the positioning of defining what digital transformation is. Digital transformation marks a radical rethinking of organization usage of technology, people, and processes. Fundamentally change business, and this definition comes from George Westerman. He's the author of Leading Digital, Turning Technology into Business Transformation. So let's look at what is happening globally, a global outlook in terms of what is currently happening in the world of work. Globally, we are seeing a current shortfall of more than 1.8 billion jobs. And this is reference, or this data comes from Track 2012. But as we know, as things continue to change going forward, we see that, these numbers, has not changed drastically. We are forecasting, or what the US futurist Thomas Free 2012 is actually predicting that by the year 2030, 2 billion jobs would have disappeared by the year 2030. So let me just. So what is happening, it's important for us to understand and for us to see in terms of what is actually happening in terms of the world of work at present. As most of you all are aware, as we move forward, a lot of things that we're accustomed to would change. A lot of industries such as construction, health, and you name it. So just looking at transportation, jobs that would be no more, or jobs that are constantly, when we look at going driverless, automobile transportation, jobs that would be lost in terms of taxi and limo drivers, bus drivers, truck drivers, even the pizza and delivery drivers may soon be a thing of the past when we look forward in terms of what is happening in the world of work. However, while we are looking forward to this whole digital transformation and how it relates to the, it's not all doom and gloom, because in everything there are opportunities. And of course, some of these opportunities include new jobs that would be created, delivery dispatchers, traffic monitoring systems. Although automated, will require a management team, driverless ride experience, driverless operation system engineers. So also looking as well, jobs which are forecast to disappear over the next 2 years. Research would have said stuff such as, loan officers, bookkeepers, drivers, because what we find happening in terms of technology is that with technology, of course, there are opportunities for, advancement. So let's just take a look at the biggest and fastest growing industries. We definitely want to look at the green and sustainable energy industry. Data has shown as well that in addition to this industry, of course, personal wellness, third, online and for-profit education. So we see a lot of persons, and even this COVID-19 pandemic has been adjusting, or you're going to see a lot of online classes, social networking games, which, the president, Mr. Anderson, would have mentioned previously, the creation of mobile apps. And those are some of the biggest and fastest growing industries. 3D printing allows for the creation of 3D solid models and objects from a digital copy, and of course, generic pharmacy. And these are some of the ways, or some of the jobs in terms of what the future would definitely look like. So these are just some of the, very briefly, these are just some of the areas in terms of, or what we can expect the future to look like. Of course, chaotic environments, disruptive technology, transport. Of course, I would have mentioned that previously in terms of, you see the driverless, vehicles. What are the work skills that are required for the future as young professionals? Of course, sense making, and that's the ability to determine deeper meaning, social intelligence, novel and adaptive thinking, cross-cultural competence, computational thinking, which speaks towards the ability to translate data into abstract concepts and understand database reasoning, new media literacy, the ability to assess and develop content for new media forms and to use these for persuasive communication. So one of the things, so that would have been basically a short synopsis as to where we are and where we're going in terms of the future of digital transformation, and it relates to the young professional. What it means, therefore, is that we as young professionals should be very adaptable and very susceptible to change. And, through the course of doing the research for this presentation, one of the things that I would have come across is that it would have been mentioned that as young professionals, and even those persons who are, as young as primary school and secondary and tertiary, going into the job market, what is actually the job market now is going to be much different. 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, and the list goes on. So what it means, therefore, that we have to, constantly update our skills, update our qualifications to go or to trend along with the time. In terms of my very last point in terms of this presentation would be in terms of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine Guild, and in terms of how we have been, moving towards that level of digital transformation as a guild. The Office of the Library would have been established, and that would have been to support the the archiving of, the archiving and keeping a digital presence of the guild's documents and records. Further to that, the Office of the Publications Committee, we are moving away from books and magazines, but taking that online. And so much, and this goes on, even with this whole COVID-19, we as a guild has been forced to take steps towards moving forward towards digital transformation. I would now hand you back over to Michael, moderator for this session.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vincent. So I now invite Mr. Felix to give his comments on Kendell's presentation.
That was a very interesting presentation on the potential future of work. One of the things that I think we should perhaps think about is the fact that, thinking about, just using the word future is a bit restrictive. I think it probably may be more helpful for us to use the word futures in the plural. Why? Because one, we don't know what the future will look like. The future is filled also with a lot of different possibilities. And those possibilities will look very different for various communities and individuals and different groups within a civil society. As it relates to youth and education, and now dealing with matters relating to employment, it raises some very, very interesting questions for us to consider. But before I go to those questions, we just want to briefly reference two very interesting international reports that were released this year. There's the 2020 Global Peace Index, and there's also the 2020 Global Talent Competitiveness Index, right? These global reports are very significant because it really does give us very interesting information regarding the performance of most countries that are in the world. And in doing so, we are able to take a more critical look, because these are data-driven reports, of course, with varying degrees of accuracy, but it gives us a sense as to what makes for success, if we want to put it like that, as it relates to digital transformation and otherwise. As it relates to young people and employment and the concept of the young professional, I think that idea of the professional needs to be very clearly defined. And the starting point for professionalism is not internships. It's not when, when you graduate and you get a job. Professionalism starts in the classroom, coming early, taking your studies seriously, that sort of thing. And sometimes the idea of being a professional is something that is presented to students as being very far off. When I would contend that that is something that needs to be, students have to be made to understand that professionalism starts, as soon as it is that they are in the classroom at a very young age. But apart from that, I think as young professionals, it's extremely important to foster two basic senses of responsibility, that being professional responsibility and social responsibility. There's a very problematic tendency for people to think in very careerist terms and not understand how their skills, their knowledge, their talents, their abilities, their experiences, their education, it fits into a larger whole. So rather than thinking of, well, how could I advance my career, but you form a part of civil society, what is your function, what is your role, and how do you fit into the context that you have to work in? And, speaking about Caribbean youth, and this is where it leads me to two basic questions here for us to consider as it relates to context. Now, these are very broad, open questions for us to perhaps reflect on. But the first question that I have is this, because we're talking about digital transformation, and I want us to understand that perhaps thinking about digital transformation in terms of just working with a computer online, that's not really digital transformation. There's a lot more to it than that. And this is why I believe it is that we need a lot more integrated thinking, thinking that is more future-oriented, thinking that is a lot more systematic rather than thinking in silos. So it leads me to these two questions here, right? The two questions I have are this. One, what are the optimal social conditions per se that allow for successful digital transformation? The second question that I would like to pose is that, is digital transformation something that is collectively negotiated within a civil society? It goes back to, is digital transformation something that people actually want? Two, what are the social conditions that allow for this? Now, going back to the two documents that I referenced earlier, before I come to a close here in this particular section, the Global Peace Index and the Global Talent Competitive Index, they are yearly reports, and you could go Google it, and you can look at the figures as it relates to various countries. And I'll give Trinidad and Tobago as an example. The metrics are not good, and the metrics include things such as enabling factors in terms of having an environment that takes into account economic factors, political factors, technological factors, and otherwise that allow for particular types of growth, development, digital transformation, of course, and other benefits to society. You also have factors that relate to attracting persons to Trinidad and Tobago for investments and otherwise. You have factors that are related to growth. And these are definitely connected to education and the labor force. Factors that are connected to actually retaining persons in Trinidad and Tobago, and also factors related to technical and vocational skills and global knowledge skills. Now, if it is that you look at the metrics for Trinidad and Tobago, and you could look at it for every country in the Caribbean, is listed there. A lot of the metrics are not good. And it points us to, probably consider that we need to figure out exactly why. And one of the things that is actually missing is knowledge production. We can't make decisions unless it is that we have knowledge, and that is premised on the fact that we have a literate society, and that we have that fostering literacy is an actual value. It's something that we prize, it's something that we cherish, and ultimately it's something that we put to use. So before we start talking about the digital, we have to go back to the foundations of literacy. And we have to ask ourselves if this is something that we want, if this is something that people want, and if this is something that people want, how is it that we can articulate some of these changes that we are really looking for based on the specific context? Because I go back to talking about the Caribbean in a broad sense, which is problematic in and of itself, because each Caribbean island is very different. And again, given the fact that the Caribbean is a place of many different peoples coming together, you have many different competing interests that are involved in that. So there's a certain level of complexity and nuance that sometimes you overlook in trying to think about the Caribbean as one unified space. Now, this isn't to say that there are not similarities or particular things that are characteristic, but I do think it is helpful for us not to think in very broad terms and make very broad generalizations because they more or less tend to be problematic. Yeah. So I'll pause there for now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Felix. I think it's some very interesting and thought-provoking things you have suggested there. And I definitely agree with you. What I'd also like to think about in relation to directly what Kendell would have suggested is where does entrepreneurship fit in if it is you want to move away from youth being so dependent on jobs and careers and such. So moving right along with our presentations today, I'd like to invite Mr. Jensen Samaroo, who is the International Affairs Committee Chairperson of the Guild Council of UWI St. Augustine. And his presentation this afternoon is on digital transformation and the Caribbean youth. I know Mr. Jensen is very passionate about the youth of the Caribbean, so this should be a very enjoyable presentation. Mr. Samaroo, I hand over to you at this time.
Thank you to my dear colleague, Mr. Joseph, and a special thank you to the CTU for affording me this opportunity to participate in this forum. Now, before I begin, I would like to say that even though I have been introduced as the International Affairs Committee Chairperson of the Guild of Students Council at the UWI St. Augustine campus, the views that are expressed here are those of my own. And whether the Guild wishes to associate itself with my views is entirely up to the Guild. But the views and opinions that are expressed here are really those of my own and does not in any way reflect, at least, the views of the Guild Council. So with that being said, I'll get into my presentation. Now, given the comments of Mr. Felix, it has also caused me to rethink a lot about the Caribbean and so on, which happily I can perhaps incorporate into my presentation. And I would like to begin firstly by saying that in the context of when I speak about the Caribbean, I generally when persons speak about the Caribbean now, they refer really to what many consider to be the Anglophone Caribbean or CARICOM, you know. So that in that sense, the scope is limited and it does not include Martinique and so on. So that is something else that we ought to be mindful of. And I think when we speak about the Caribbean identity, that is a part that is left out, and we see the dominance of the English Caribbean being what is seen as the Caribbean identity. So all those complexities come in when defining the Caribbean. And also it is a complexity that exists for the Caribbean youth as we attempt to now navigate our way. And, you know, in a global world, do we define ourselves as Caribbean citizens? Do we want to move away from defining ourselves as Guyanese or as Trinidadians or Dominicans? And I think it is especially important for me to draw on something that was done years ago when Eric Williams would have written Capitalism and Slavery. And he had written to the editors actually asking them if they can refer to him not as a Trinidadian, but rather as a West Indian who was born in Trinidad. I found that to be very profound because he kind of incorporates the Caribbean and, well, West Indian identity. Whether or not we want to use that term is another debate, but the Caribbean identity into his national identity as well. So with that being said, I'll get into a lot of my presentation. Now, Caribbean societies as we know them today have been shaped largely by the historical experience and processes of colonialism, slavery, indentureship, and imperialism. And much of what we enjoy today in terms of our freedoms, in terms of rights, in terms of aspirations and everything, were fought for by our ancestors. And gaining independence was indeed a hallmark achievement in our history. And having achieved independence, Caribbean nations were given the opportunity to dictate the direction in which they want to move. And for a very long time, many generations of Caribbean leaders have had a vision of development which caters rather, not only for their individual countries, but the region as a whole. And we have had Caribbean academics and scholars offering theories and models of development, some of which have been pursued either in whole or in part, and others have been abandoned. And today now, the Caribbean continues to struggle really to find a particular part of development as a region. Even countries struggle to find models of development that suit them, individual countries, but also collectively as a region. That is still a struggle that we have. And nevertheless, the dream of having an integrated and socially just and united Caribbean has a long way to go in being fully realized. But many of us, including myself, who still believe in the dream, continue to hold on to and work towards it. And as we continue to navigate our way, we look towards a future which we have been tasked with shaping. Now, when we think of the modern world and modern conceptions of development, we automatically think about skyscrapers and technological advancements. And from my own assessment, I think this has been due largely or in part to the fact that our ideas of development have come to be shaped largely by looking to the societies of the global north and using them as a benchmark as we pursue our own course of development. And of course, as Mr. Felix would have mentioned in his comments, that it is for us to decide now, what are these things? Is it feasible to pursue this? Is it not? Is it something that people want? Is it something that is counterproductive? So we have to move away really from using the global north as a benchmark as we continue to pursue our own course of development. I think that's a very important point to register. And while it is important as well to acknowledge that indeed my generation has found itself in a world, or to be in a world that is defined greatly, but not only by, and that is very important, it is defined greatly, but not entirely and only by technological innovation and advancement. We must equally acknowledge that digital transformation and development should not be the only item in our agenda or on our agenda for development. In my early years of growing up in the hinterland of Guyana, cell phones were bigger than my hands, and television sets had an extension behind them, which we would hit sometimes if they were not working, and believe that we were IT specialists. And I have been fortunate, I think, to live through, and others, of course, would have seen different levels of transformation over time. But for me personally, I've been fortunate to live through and witness, for instance, the evolution of listening to rupee songs on a cassette, then on a CD, to now streaming it through YouTube on my laptop. And these, of course, are major leaps and changes that has occurred over time, and it has changed our thinking and how we interact with the world as youth. So that is something peculiar, not only to my generation, but the generation before us. But they would have, of course, been from record to cassette to CD, now to streaming on laptops. Of course, a lot of persons reject these transformations, and we have to be mindful of that as well. You know, only recently my father joined Facebook, and that was a major achievement. So we have to be conscious that while we have a generation who is embracing digital transformation, we also have another generation simultaneously who have some persons not entirely rejecting, although some of them do, but you have persons as well who are not too fond of it, you know, and we have to be conscious and cater for that as well. And we are indeed conscious of how digitized large portion of our world is. But here in the Caribbean, it would be misleading to claim that we are anywhere near where we want to be. And I think COVID-19 in particular, or with the advent of COVID-19 and the pandemic, it has shown us many things, the world and the Caribbean. It has shown us many things, but three of which I wish I had highlight. Number one, it has forced us to heavily utilize digital platforms for work and school and other things. Number two, it has exposed the inequalities that exist in our world, demonstrating to us, for instance, how wide the gap, the digital divide really is. And number three, it has shown us how interconnected our world is and how certain things, that is to say COVID-19 in particular, has no regard for borders and sovereignty. So now in the context of Caribbean and Caribbean integration, I think we can now rightfully say that borders only exist in our minds, and we can move beyond that. Because like I said, COVID-19 has shown us it has no regard for borders and sovereignty. But most importantly, I think COVID-19 has given us the opportunity to rethink how we operate as a society and really define our priorities. Caribbean youths in particular now have the opportunity to, I think they always have, but this has kind of brought it out a little more, or had the opportunity now to determine what does development really mean for us. And even when we think about digital transformation, we have to think about it in the context of our own ideas as a generation of sustainable development and other conceptions of development. And how do we want to pursue digital transformation? And again, is it something feasible? Is it something that the people want? You know, some people would rather you give them a piece of land to farm, rather than giving them a mobile phone. And what do these things mean in the context of integration? Do we want a Caribbean as we have now, how it has developed, where there are disparities in terms of levels of development? You know, Trinidad and Tobago is of course different in terms of their development and the stage that they're at right now, at least in terms of industry and manufacturing, from Belize and from Dominica and Barbados and Guyana. And do we want to have, for instance, 5G in Dominica and 4G in Belize? And those are things we need to think about if we want to pursue a course of development that consists of our own notions of the Caribbean and that kind of intersects with that and everything. And digital transformation would mean a lot of replacing of structures and our operations of bureaucracies, age-old bureaucracies and political structures and everything, and navigating all of that. So really and truly, I think the Caribbean youth, we have two things to do. One, we have to embrace these changes as well. And we are the ones to move things forward in, you know, the previous generation might have depended on something else and they would have steered us to where we are now. But a lot of persons, of course, with the advent of new technology, there are new jobs available, as Kendell would have highlighted. And those are things that are in the minds of people. So as we go that course, you have to think about how can we as youths contribute to enhancing the lives of our people in the Caribbean. Even given the context of digital transformation and the wider agenda of developing the Caribbean as a whole. And that is most important, I think, even if we were to transform digitally, but our people are still, or there's still heavy poverty in the region, and people are still, you know, there's high levels of unemployment and everything.
Mr. Samaroo, yes, sorry, I just wanted to make you aware that you're over your time, and I'd like you to just wrap up quickly so we could allow Mr. Felix to give his comments and stay within our allotted time.
All right, thank you. I'm about to close. But thank you for the reminder, and sorry for going over time. There's a lot more, I think, that could be said, some of which might come out in the question and answer segment. But I think to really wrap up much of what I've been said, I would draw on the wise words of a famous Calypsonian who is known as Black Stallion, I think, throughout the Caribbean. There's a particular line in one of his songs where he says, and I'll adjust it a bit to incorporate, or to negate gender biases. He said that there is one race, the Caribbean man, and I'll add, and woman, from the same place, the Caribbean man and woman, that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention for a better life in the region. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean man and the Caribbean woman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Samaroo. I very much like the closing line that you had there. And now ask Mr. Felix to give his comments somewhat briefly so that we can have enough time for the rest of our agenda and stay somewhat in line with our time constraint. Mr. Felix.
Thank you very much. All right, so I'll try to be very brief in commenting on the last presentation there. So four brief things before it is that I elaborate on some very brief definitions. The first is that we have to understand that there are no such thing as solutions. We have trade-offs. So if it is that we want to gain something, we're going to have to lose something. That's generally a rule of life. There are no solutions, there are trade-offs. So nothing is free in that sense. We also have to make a distinction between, when we're speaking about matters of equality or inequality, there's a difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And we can run into a lot of issues if we're talking about digital transformation where we confuse the two because they are not the same, right? And there are varying reasons for inequalities, and there are some reasons that are outside anyone's control. It's not always because there's some sort of evil overlord oppressing people. Some of it is based on people's own personal choices and the consequences of those choices, or sometimes it could be something as simple as geographic factors and otherwise. In talking about digital transformation, this is my third point here, I think we need to move away from talking about technology to some degree in materialist terms, right? Technology is not just about, the technical aspects of things, but we need to consider the social and the ideological, because technology would not exist unless there was an actual use for it, and unless there was an actual context for it, and unless there were social conditions that actually gave rise to it. So to just look at technology or digital transformation in terms of just the technical aspects of it, which is extremely important, we also need to not think in silos, but to understand that there are other aspects of it as well. As it relates to the previous presentation as well, I think that neocolonialism is something that is very real, particularly in the Caribbean, and especially so given that a lot of influences, particularly from the US, find its way into the Caribbean and find its way into the discourses that are there. And we need to make a very clear separation between the peoples that live in the Caribbean and the peoples that live outside of the Caribbean. We are not the same. We do not have the same issues. We do not have issues of quote unquote systemic this and systemic that and institutional that in the same way that in other parts of the world, they have that. So it's very problematic when people start discussing the Caribbean as though it is that we were some other part of the world. We are, and this leads me to what I want to talk about here very briefly in terms of when we say that as the Caribbean, we want to be a modern people, what do we mean by that? That is something that we need to be very clear on, and we need to be very clear in terms of how that looks. So when we look at the whole idea of modernity or being in a modern society, we're looking at ideas of progressive change that are more or less amplified by globalization and underpinned by a sense of rationality, secularization, and so on and so forth. So we have examples of this in terms of nation branding and urbanization and workforce development, migration, and so on and so forth. And this definitely has significant impacts in terms of our politics, our economics, and various social spheres. What I think is very key, and it's not something that people talk about because we talk about the technology or the environment or the legal system and that sort of thing. All of these things are underpinned by values. And the good things that we see in society, so the bad things that we see, or the problematic things, or the things that are desirable, they are all premised on ideas. They're premised on values. And it would really be remiss of us to focus our efforts in terms of digital transformation and not focus on fostering values. What are quote unquote Caribbean values, right? What is the value system that we work within that enables us to undertake efforts in digital transformation and that allows for it to be successful? Hence the reason why I asked the question earlier, what are some of the optimal conditions that allow for successful digital transformation? How is it something that is negotiated and that is actually beneficial to as much people as possible that are open to the process, and that it is something that is enriching for society and it doesn't, how should I say, it doesn't increase or exasperate some of the existing issues that we already have. One way forward, I believe, and I will say this in closing, is this notion of reflexive governance, which is future oriented, and it is focused on intended outcomes. And it's a very responsive way of actually dealing with things. And what it requires for us to do is to look at ourselves as a post-colonial region and try to figure out exactly what is it that we want. Is it that we want to stay in our little silos of being, well, I'm part of this nation, I'm part of that nation, or is it that we want to think regionally? If that is the case, there needs to be a complete shift in our politics. There needs to be a complete shift in the structures of thinking that we have, and in terms of how digital transformation also goes in line, or how it can be an expression of ideas that we have about our particular space that we inhabit. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Felix. Some very thought-provoking ideas once again. I now would like to invite Ms. Liana Silochan, who is the Guild Librarian of the Guild Council for the academic year 2020-2021, to give a short note of thanks at this time. Liana?
Hi, thank you all. Thank you so much, moderator, and thank you to the panelists for that very fruitful discussions and contributions. I just wanted to briefly thank the CTU for this opportunity and to specifically mention the previous acting Secretary General, Ms. Bernadette Lewis, who has obviously paved the way for youth involvement in such a forum as this. It's the 16th, and I feel very honored, along with my colleagues, to participate. And I know that our contributions won't go fruitless, vice versa. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you all on behalf of the Guild Library and my committee.
Thank you very much, Liana. So we'll have a brief Q&A session as we are upon 3 o'clock. Mr. Casimir, can you advise me as such if it is you'd like things to change?
If you're asking if you would like me, if I would like you to do it?
If you'd like to change things, I know we are up on 3 o'clock, which was our scheduled
okay,
time to end.
Yeah, we can manage to 3:15 because we can take the break at 3:15 and resume the last session at 3:30 as scheduled.
Okay, great, thank you. So, Mr. Felix, a question to you, sir. What would you consider, and this question comes in from, I can't see who sent it in, but yes, the question to you, sir, what would you consider or prescribe to as the appropriate level of efforts required to address the non-technical considerations, i.e., regional culture, business processes, redesign, and people development in order to successfully and comprehensively engage a national digital transformation drive?
Okay, that's an interesting question because it kind of juxtaposes two different things, right? There's this contrast between the national and the regional. And we need to be very clear in terms of where our priorities lie. Is it that we see ourselves as being part of a region first or being part of a nation first, right? And we have to look at how it is that our conception of nation and region are actually constructed. And going further back, these are premised on particular types of ideas. And these ideas, they find their articulation in particular types of discourses, meaning they find their ways in institutions and how we speak about things, and in the things that we do in people who exemplify these ideas. And ultimately, these are the starting points for political discussions. And talking about politics, we're talking about politics in the sense of power. And in terms of, we're looking at things from an ideological perspective in terms of ideas and how ideas are articulated materially. Now, one of the things that people often do is that when we look up to quote unquote developed nations, wherever they are, whatever part of the world that they may be in, there's a tendency to look at what they have accomplished and what they're able to do and the standards of living that are there and so on and so forth. That didn't just come about just like that. that isn't because, well, they just happen to have great infrastructure. It isn't because they just happen to have a good education system. It's premised on ideas. It's premised on having a very, very clear plan. It's usually written down and it's usually repeated. So it's part of the popular discourse in terms of what is it that we want for ourselves? What is it do we want to see manifest materially? What is it that we want to perpetuate ideologically? Who is it that we are? What is our identity? And that has to be the starting point, I believe, if any sort of constructive discussions need to be had in terms of progress at both national and regional levels. Because if it is that we look at social issues related to crime, inequality, migration, and so on and so forth, I think it is that a discussion on values is almost absent in every instance. And there isn't a clear articulation in many instances of exactly, well, what does it mean to be somebody from Grenada? What does it mean to be somebody from Ghana? What does it mean to be somebody from the region? What does that mean, right? Now, we've had persons within the region and in our respective nations articulating these ideas, but for one reason or the other, they haven't picked up currency. But I think the first thing is that it's premised on ideas. Now, moving from ideas to something a bit more concrete in terms of being a lot more practical, there is a very, and this comes out of, you know, the political sciences and urban studies and so on and so forth. There is something in the literature that is called reflexive governance, right? It is a very adaptive mode of engaging with problems and also being future oriented and being very participatory in its orientation, meaning that it's not just about people holding positions of power making decisions, but there's consultation, there is a certain degree of flexibility. So it is that it involves a particular sense of diversity in the perspectives that are taken into account when decisions are made. The interactions are not dominated by one particular group. There's a sense of equality that's there. So one of the first, one of the fundamental pillars is knowledge production and literacy, very, very important. Next, there's a sense of experimentation, and people are very quick to dispense with something that doesn't work. So it is that it tends to be very iterative in terms of goal formulation and achieving those goals. It is very future oriented. It doesn't just look at what is convenient in the now. The strategies that are actually involved are very, very interactive. And it's about looking at context and looking very closely at all the persons that are involved in the issue. So for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, usually with the issue of crime, people keep blaming the police. Well, the police not doing this and the police not doing that, but we have a justice system. Why is it called a justice system? Because you have lawmakers, you have the courts, you have a lot of different people that are involved in that. So you just can't look at one component of it and trace all the social problems to just this one component or just blame it on a particular party that may be in power. We have to look at this in terms of all of the actors that are involved in it. And see where the gaps actually are, and if it is that there's actually a sense of cohesion and people actually working together to try to have progress and being aware of what the issues are and actually transparently dealing with it. And this is the reason why it is that I referred to documents such as the Global Peace Index and the Global Talent Competitiveness Index, because the indicators that we find on those for some Caribbean nations are especially troubling. So if it is that we want to try to address certain types of issues, it starts with a foundation of knowing where the issues lie and addressing it from there, not having conjecture and working with that data towards finding, you know, more data-driven solutions, so to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Felix. Another question to you at this time is, do you have any thoughts on whether the multi-stakeholder bottom-up governance culture of the internet aids or addresses the development or digital transformation you speak of moving forward?
Okay, that's a very good That's a very good question. I'll respond to it by this. There's actually a book called Misunderstanding the Internet, right? And one of the arguments that have been laid out in that book by the authors is the fact that the internet is often heralded as something that is emancipatory. It's going to free us. It's going to unleash these new possibilities. But the thing is that what we see in cyberspace is that sometimes some of the same issues are just replicated. But because of the nature of digital spaces and digital technologies, these issues are actually amplified, right? So the progress that people are able to make is in direct relation, not just to their own political will or their own individual agency, but it's also a result of their context. And I'll give you a very good example. Now, on social media, it's quite common to see videos with quote unquote inspirational stories of very famous people. But there are a lot of problems with looking at those type of things. Firstly, generally, a lot of those quote unquote inspirational peoples, they come from the US, right? Secondly, they are exceptional cases. So it is that you cannot quote unquote duplicate their success. They are anomalies. And we have to make a distinction between the norms and the anomalies, right? So for example, it is not the norm to drop out of school and be successful. The sociological evidence suggests that you have a higher chance of social mobility once it is that you are educated. That has been proven for a very, very long time. That is the general way in which it is that things work. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that when we see success stories, people are successful for a number of different quote unquote, depending on how you define success, of course, they're successful for a number of different reasons. So if the success of some sort of strategy needs to work, I go back to the question of what are the optimal conditions that allow for digital transformation or any sort of progress, so to speak, that we want as a modern society, as a modern civil society, as a modern Caribbean people. And it points us back to questions of context. Is the context that we're in, does it enable certain types of changes that we want to see? Are the changes moving along at the pace that we would like? How does the context fit into it? Does the context work for us or does it work against us, right? Because the contexts are made up of human actors, they're made up of institutions and different social and political systems that will either offer constraints or would be means to enable certain types of actions and progress.
Thank you very much, Mr. Felix, for your response. The next question is to the three guild panelists, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Vincent, and Mr. Samaroo. And the question reads, if there is one recommendation you would give to contribute to molding an effective environment for DT and youth, what would it be? DT being digital transformation. Gentlemen. I invite Mr. Anderson to go first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joseph. My contribution here would be to examine where youth are. What is the young people of the country or the region plugged into? Only then can we examine how digital transformation can come into play. Because focusing on the word transformation by itself, it suggests that we're transforming from what exists into something that is enhanced, right? So examining where we are and what we desire in the youth space. Yes, it is defined in certain policy documents and these kind of things, but a lot of it is dynamic and it takes maintaining pace with young people so that the policy documents and these things, we don't have too much of a dissonance between the beat of young people and what is enshrined in these policy documents. So I am of the personal belief that beginning to bridge that gap begins in our culture as it relates to entertainment. So all these stories that we've told, where we have captured our history, you know, oral tradition is very important to us, but all our music, the beat of the Caribbean, we're making strides in fashion and movies and these things now. So digital transformation should speak to how do we transform our culture into an offering to the rest of the world, closing the economic gap, if I'm to borrow from Mr. Felix, making a trade-off between our culture and the global culture, and using that to fill the gap. So the transformation, therefore, for youth should be selling ourselves, selling our offerings, and selling our experiences and how we interact with each other. And how that plays into our learning, tertiary, primary, secondary, etc. Because our culture and entertainment is very important to us. So if I was to even to begin to describe what unifies us as a Caribbean and what defines us as a Caribbean, I would start with entertainment. I would start with culture, because whereas the other attempts to define us pose many challenges, when we talk about music and entertainment and these things, we tend to find a common thread there quite easily, in my opinion. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Samaroo, quickly.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult for me to just offer one thing, but I think generally I would have to say inclusion in the first place. And this goes across the board, not just inclusion in terms of digital transformation or attempts to pursue whatever level of digital transformation, but inclusion of you generally in policy making and everything. And not just a kind of tokenism inclusion that often occurs throughout the region and elsewhere in the world, where youths only are given a seat at the table just because, you know, you want youth representation for that facade, but to really value our contributions that we have to make, because we are developing youths as the world is developing in itself. And we have meaningful contributions to make. So, you know, it really bothers me that you have persons in rooms with good AC who make decisions on people's life based on statistics and don't necessarily go and consult with those people. So youth inclusion into any developmental agenda, I think it is important, and that would greatly aid in fostering an environment where we can really think about what does digital transformation mean and all these things. Before we even get to the transformation in and of itself, we have to include youths to have them thinking about what it could mean, how it could be, what it could not be, and all those things. So inclusion, inclusion, inclusion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Samaroo. Some very interesting points there. Mr. Felix, the final question to you and the Guild panelists as well, and it comes from the Guild PRO, Mr. Kendell Hazelwood, and his question to you, gentlemen, what is one recommendation you will give to CARICOM with respect to youth and digital transformation? So I'll invite Mr. Felix to answer first, and then Mr. Anderson and Mr. Samaroo. Just keeping in mind that we are at 3:50.
Okay. My recommendation is, okay.
Just saying they're a little over right now, but please go ahead briefly.
Okay. My recommendation is very simple, and I'm attempting to more or less build on all of the previous presentations. I think it is that one recommendation is to really consider the conditions that allow for successful digital transformation. Not just thinking of the technology, not just thinking about internet connections, laptops, digital devices, but what are the conditions that allow for digital transformation that are very considerate of youth So it means making data-driven decisions. It means investing in research. It means listening to our experts, which is very important, and having consultations with youths, and ensuring that these decisions are informed as it relates to creating the optimal conditions that allow for successful digital transformation among youths.
Thank you very much, Mr. Felix. Mr. Anderson?
Well, Mr. Felix has covered the foundation quite perfectly. So it's difficult to build from there, but what I would like to see that perhaps, if I'm right in my theory, that CARICOM gives support to young people with respect to digital transformation in unifying the region digitally, carving out a space for us where we can say this is Caribbean owned, right? Where we can claim our browser as a Caribbean owned browser, where we can claim an intellectual property space the same way where we try to log on to certain movies and music, and we are restricted based on our region. I would like to see that persons try to get into the Caribbean region to access our music and our movies, etc., and all our intellectual property, and they face a restriction that they would have to offer us foreign exchange for, thereby, strengthening the economic drive of the region. That is my wish for support from CARICOM.
Very interesting point there, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Samaroo, quickly.
Yeah, I think my recommendation would be to, one, strengthen youth policies, to have this kind of thing included in it. You have in some countries, youth policies been absent. And I think even whilst countries may seek to have national or at the level of CARICOM, regional kind of policy to foster an environment for digital transformation, that needs to be incorporated, or at least what do you want from youths, which of course comes with consultation, into national youth policies, and have national youth councils and other youth groups that exist. And you have many throughout the Caribbean Regional Youth Council, even the Guild of Students, who represent a large portion of young people, and have those groups really craft a kind of policy, or be engaged in crafting a kind of policy. Now, just before I close, I think one of the things absent actually in young people and in movements is our ability to communicate in the language of the state. And that is something that we have to develop. But of course, there are many hindrances to that. But even while we engage with governments and so on and craft policies, that is a skill we have to develop. And hopefully governments can help us to develop that state, to communicate in the language of the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Samaroo. So in closing, I'd like to say thank you for all those who are listening, wherever you are. I thank you. And I'd like to thank personally the CTU for this opportunity, not only for myself, but by extension the Guild, as well as the Library Committee of the Guild Council for this great opportunity. So Mr. Kasimi, I pass back over to you. Your mic is muted, sir.
Good night. Joe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Joseph. I think the discussion broaden the scope of what we would normally have at a CIGF. Typically, the audience here, I guess, are a bit more on the technical side or on the implementation side. So, but I think what came out here is some kind of some first principles type thinking, in a sense, reminding us, and this is something I recall from my days at university. There was the big discussion about appropriate technology, right? Technology was moving on and there were options out there, and But there was this discussion about the appropriate technology. What's appropriate for us in the Caribbean? What's appropriate for us in our individual nations and that sort of thing. And we almost take for granted the benefits to be derived from digital transformation and so on. And I think it's reminded us that it needs a context. It needs a context, and when you adopt it, you must know what you're doing, why you're adopting it, where you're going to apply it, and that sort of thing. So I think that type of thinking was brought out in the discussions that we heard, and I think I too would like to thank all of the presenters from the Guild and Mr. Felix as well for the content that you provided to the CIGF this afternoon.